This past summer, I had the really cool opportunity to spend a couple weeks riding and essentially living off of a 2019 Honda XR650L. I got to ride this bike on pavement, on dirt roads, in sandy terrain, in rocky technical terrain. I rode this bike in the daytime, I rode it in the nighttime, I rode it in the rain, I climbed mountains, and I obviously camped off of this bike. Now that I've said all that, we're left with the question of, for the purposes of dual sport and adventure riding, how good is the XR650L? The XR650L is really the epitome of the saying, if it ain't broke, then why fix it? Honda brought this bike to market way back in 1993, and since then, it's pretty much unchanged. So if you're looking into buying one, then odds are this review will apply to XR650Ls from the early 90s all the way until now. As for the bike in this video, it is a 2019 model that has been desmogged with stock carburetor settings, a Leo Vince muffler, and an aftermarket clutch pack. It's running a 15-tooth front sprocket, a 45-tooth rear sprocket, Dunlop D606 dual sport tires. It has the stock suspension, stock brakes, and it is also running a lowering link to bring the seat height down 1 inch. It also has an aftermarket fuel tank that can hold 4 gallons, an oversized seat, aftermarket handlebars, and a vented front fender to help with engine cooling. Then for luggage, it has a billet aluminum rack that is sitting over the rear fender. It's got a couple other miscellaneous upgrades, but nothing else really tied to bike performance or handling. Just like the rest of the bike, the 650 motor is ultra simple and very reliable. It's a 644cc, air-cooled, single-cylindered super thumper that utilizes a single overhead camshaft and Honda's battle-tested RFVC cylinder head. This is then paired with a 5-speed wide-ratio transmission, a 42.5mm CV carburetor, and a 2-in-1 exhaust system. Now, despite having a relatively large motor, dyno tests only place it at between 30 to 35 horsepower at just over 6,000 RPMs, which in my experience is pretty accurate, I think. Though I would like to point out again that I'm riding a bike that has been desmogged and has some power mods done to it. In my experience, and this is an average between both dirt and street riding, I got about 40 miles per gallon pretty consistently, which I think is plenty satisfactory for a carbed bike, but I am also running a desert tank, and even then, on a large stretch of dirt, I did have to use some fuel bottles. Now, where I think the motor really exceeded my expectations was in the amount of raw torque that it has. Between my camera gear and other equipment that I brought with me, it's no secret that I way overpacked for this trip. That said, the motor was pretty much unfazed by all that extra weight. I specifically remember one mountain that we had climbed on this trip that was multiple miles in length to reach the summit, and any other bike, with or without luggage, would have struggled on the hill climb. And yet here I was, on the 650, the cheapest bike out of all of us, with the most luggage weighing on the back, and I was leading the pack to the top. Honestly, I think the only part of this bike that struggled with hills were the brakes, and I will get to those here in a minute. Moving on to power delivery, the first thing that frustrated me about this motor was the transmission, and not for the reason that you'd expect.
Dang it, neutral. I half shift this thing all the time between first and second.
Over the course of that 2-week ride, I must have half shifted into neutral at least 30 times. There is an abnormally large gap between first and second gear that makes it just too easy to half shift into neutral instead of shifting all the way into second. As for it being a 5-speed transmission instead of a 6-speed transmission, it actually doesn't bother me all that much. I'd imagine that's probably a little bit of a personal preference because I'm mainly an off-road rider, so the times that I ride on street are usually the times that I'm commuting to a trail. That said, on the 650 for street riding, it's really most comfortable at around 55 miles an hour. You could probably push to 65, but if you're going to be doing a long stretch of street, you'd probably want to stick to 55. It's also worth mentioning that the XR650L has a very heavy flywheel, and it does come in handy for slow speed riding. This clip's a really good example where I'm riding pretty slow over decently uneven terrain, and I'm just sitting down, thumping along at a low RPM, and it wasn't much of an issue at all, whereas my friends on their Teneres had to fight a little bit harder to get their bikes up the trail. When riding off-road, for the most part, I found myself living in 3rd and 4th gear in the mid-range RPMs. For the most part, all the usable power is between 2,000 and 5,500 RPMs. There's very little over-rev, and you spend very, very little time using those higher RPMs. Now, that's not to say that you can't crank on the motor and wring it out for all the power that it's got, but I just rarely felt the need to. Alright, now I want to transition over to a really important topic, which is the lifespan of this bike, how serviceable it is, how durable, how reliable, all those things. I have no doubt that there are plenty of people out there that would look at the XR650L and say that it just has dated technology next to modern bikes. Me personally, I would not look at that as a bad thing. In fact, I would argue that that is probably one of the biggest selling points of this bike. Let me put it to you this way. It has a low compression ratio of 8 to 3 to 1, which allows it to run lower octane fuels if you were riding in a place that had questionable fuel sources. The lower compression ratio also puts less strain on the motor's internal components, which leads to a longer engine lifespan. The motor is air cooled, so your only risk of overheating is if the motor gets too packed in with mud. Gasoline is gravity fed into the carburetor from the gas tank, so you'll never have to worry about a blown fuel pump. Your clutch cable is non-hydraulic, so you'll never have to worry about a blown slave cylinder or a hydraulic fluid leak. And finally, and this is probably one of my favorite things about this bike, it was designed so that you could pretty much fix or service any part of this bike with a very standard toolkit in the middle of nowhere. Unlike some European bikes or a lot of modern bikes, there isn't nearly as much need to have specialized tools to work on this thing. You have a quick release side panel if you ever needed to get access to your battery to jumpstart it or begin troubleshooting your electrical system. You can also use that same quick release side panel to get access to your air filter if you needed to clean it in the field. On a previous trip, this bike got stuck in the mud and burnt out a clutch pack, and literally, once we were able to order parts to our location, I just replaced the clutch with the hand tools that I had in my trail bag. Having mechanical knowledge on how to work on your bikes is always going to be a good skill, but even if you've never worked on your bike before, this motor is so simple and so approachable, it's great to learn on. Now would also be a good time to mention that this bike has a dry sump, meaning that it holds oil in the frame. And a whole lot of it, actually. The XR650 motor holds over 2 quarts of oil, which part of the reason is it's air-cooled, so it's going to tend to run a bit hotter. But the other reason is that the XR650 motor is claimed to burn oil under high stress. This is something that I did experience on this trip, but only once. Over the course of those 2 weeks, I did check my oil a good couple times, and I never had a concern about the oil volume until the very end. On the same day that we rode up that huge mountain, we also rode in total over 160 miles. And on top of that, the weather turned against us and we had to ride into the night, into the rain, and struggled in the mud for hours. So as you can imagine, I totally cooked my oil, and by the time I actually got around to looking at it, I realized that I had burned a substantial amount. What's even more impressive is you can see I cut open the oil filter and there were no metal particulates or shavings or anything that I was concerned about. So with that story, let's talk about this bike's lifespan as well as its insatiable appetite for abuse. When looking for used XR650Ls for sale, I have seen countless with over 10,000 miles, plenty with over 15,000 miles, and a good few with over 20,000 miles. Then I combine that with the experiences we had on this trip. Our bikes were sucking in so much moon dust and wildfire smoke and all kinds of other pollutants. I cold started the 650 in temperatures so cold that our water storage had frozen over.
This is good. This is really good.
I rode the 650 so hard through the mud and the rain and up mountains that I burned a concerning amount of oil. And guess what? I topped it off with motor oil from the gas station and kept going. So after all of this, if you were to ask me if the XR650L passes the test of being dependable in rough conditions, I would say yes, with flying colors. Alright, now I gotta even the score. I've been saying too many good things. Another thing that bothered me about the 650 is the headlight. It feels very weak. I got a lot of comments from people saying that my headlight was aimed upwards, and I guess maybe that was the case, but I don't think that the headlight had been adjusted any differently since coming from the factory. Regardless, in my opinion, I felt that the old school style halogen bulb was kind of ineffective at night, and I felt reliant on my friend's headlights. I'm not quite sure what the aftermarket options are for the XR650L if you wanted to buy, say, a new headlight kit or something. But if you are going to buy an XR650L, you might want to consider looking into the headlight options as well. Alright, now going further into the electrical system of the bike, the stator output is about 180 watts, so you can see I am running a few accessories. On the left hand side, I have a dual USB charger, and typically I use that to charge camera equipment in the front pack. Then on the right, I have my Garmin Zumo GPS, and that is directly linked to the battery as well to keep the Garmin charged. In my experience, the 180 watts was more than enough to keep the motorcycle battery charged as well as all of my additional equipment. Now that said, I did make the mistake a good few times of walking away from my bike while the engine was off off with the key in the ignition so the headlight was on and my accessories were drawing power from the battery. As you'll see in the next clip, bump starting is a little bit tough, but if you do it in second gear and have enough of a hill, it's possible.
We're gonna get some good speed going. I'm gonna throw it in second. Yeah!
Alright, now what about brakes, suspension, and bike handling? When talking about the brakes, the first word that comes to my mind is the word functional, but I definitely wouldn't call them high performance. Now that said, what also should be taken into consideration is the engine braking power that the 650 has. If you're coming down a hill, throw it in second gear and coast, and you will be quickly surprised at how little you actually need to rely on those brakes. Just as a warning though, if you're running heavy bags like I was, and if you're coming down a hill and not using engine braking, this may happen to you.
Oh geez. Well, that's good to know. I just lost my rear brake for a moment. That was really weird. I think my brake might have gotten too hot coming down that. I gotta let that cool down. Whoa. Oh yeah, you cooked the shit out of it. Oh. Yeah, I melted that whole thing.
Now for the suspension, I kinda have mixed feelings about it. First off, the bike sits very tall, and even at 6'1", I was really happy to have that lowering link. The stock suspension also felt kind of soft, which does lead to more bottoming out. But then again, if I wanted to ride really technical trails or try and jump this pig off of a 100-foot triple, I probably wouldn't have had 60 pounds worth of stuff on the back. I mainly was interested in a comfortable and capable bike to explore the backcountry with. So here's where the benefit comes in. Because it's basically a heavy dirt bike or a heavy dual sport plus the weight of me and the weight of my bags and the soft suspension, it feels very planted. In other words, as long as I don't blow through the suspension and bottom it out, most of what's happening underneath me doesn't translate up to the bars, and I have very little head shake. This gave the bike a very comfortable, if not playful feel when I was riding through decently rough terrain at a pretty good rate of speed. You can see in this clip here where the terrain starts to get a lot rockier, and yes, I do eventually slow down a bit, but at the same time, I'm hitting these rocks pretty square on, and I'm not even feeling the need to stand up. I'm just rolling through it. Now let's consider the opposite scenario. In the next clip, my friend hits a rock, and instead of going through it, he deflects off of it, and you'll see all of the energy translates to his bars.
We're definitely getting deeper into that, you know, sort of high desert country. Oh, Carter down.
So at the end of the day, did I bottom out the XR650L a bunch of times? Yes, I definitely did. But I do feel that the soft suspension was a benefit to me for the type of riding that I was doing. Now, another comment that I have about the suspension, which is slightly off topic but nonetheless still relevant, is about the length of the forks. More specifically, look how far they extend past the front axle. Now, I'm sure there's some kind of benefit to it, like maybe it gives them the ability to run longer springs, or it gives the fork tubes a longer stroke, I don't know. But I do know that it makes the lower forks highly smackable. You can see this one definitely has a good couple battle scars. At the end of the day, scratches are fine, but cracks and leaking fork oil are not. Alright, now let's take the bags off, let's forget about adventure riding and moto camping and all of that, and let's focus on the XR650 as a dirt bike. By dirt bike standards, at just shy of 350 pounds, it is going to be 100 pounds heavier than the average dirt bike. Because of that, it takes a lot more manhandling and shifting your weight and just a lot more physical exertion to ride this bike hard on trails. I also don't think I would ever take this bike out riding single track in the mountains. It's just too heavy and I think it would wear me out way too fast. Now for riding trails in the desert, I think it's more than capable. You don't have to jump down logs, there's not as many obstacles, you can keep your speed up, it's great. Alright, back to adventure riding. So before I let this review get too long, I need to answer the question that I asked at the very beginning of the video. For those of you that forgot what the question was, it essentially was asking how well does the XR650L serve the purposes of being a dual sport or a lightweight adventure bike. To be honest with you, I think it may very well be one of the best bikes out there, and I'll tell you why. The combination of having a price point of $7,000 brand new, having a very long lifespan, and the fact that it's virtually unchanged since the 90s, that means you can buy one used with a few thousand miles for probably dirt cheap, maybe $4,000 or $5,000 at the most, and you know One, it's gonna last because it's very reliable, and two, you're not missing out on any changes to the bike because they haven't changed it since the 90s. Then as a moto camping platform, I can already tell you from experience, it is fantastic. It can carry everything that I need and more for me to feel comfortable being 1,000 miles away from home and having everything I need. The way that I look at this bike is almost like a pack mule or a workhorse. Is it fast and sporty? No. But can it carry everything you need and be reliable and dependable enough to take you to the ends of the earth? I'd say yeah, probably. I think the reason that you buy an XR650L is more so for the adventures that you can have on it or the places that it can take you, as opposed to it being an exhilarating vehicle to ride. Over the course of the 2 weeks that I spent living on this bike and exploring the backcountry, I had the time of my life and I made some incredible memories. And that was more in line with the experience that I wanted to have as opposed to what experience I have with my other dual sport. So if you're looking for a bike that is budget friendly and very capable of taking you on some serious adventures, I would say this bike is a really great option. Save a couple of bucks and buy a used one, then spend that money on the adventures that you'll have with that bike. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, do me a favor and hit the like button down below. It really helps. And if you're interested in seeing the adventure where all this footage came from, I will leave a link to that playlist at the end of this video.